We're going to go back to trees, but this time they're going to be a little more up close than in our misty forest scene. We're doing a sunlit, wooded forest, and it's going to be really beautiful, hopefully, I think. Let's get started. Welcome to day 8 of the Painting the Wilderness Challenge, my friend. And today we are diving even deeper into the messiness of creativity with a streaming sunlit forest. As a reminder, I'm giving away one copy of my book every day during this challenge. And if you want to enter that giveaway, watch to the end of this video. So I'm prepping my watercolor notebook with washi tape on all four sides, leaving a little bit loose so I can wrap it around, and then using binder clips to keep the paper even more taut. This is to make warping, to make my paper warp less, although it will still likely warp a little bit. So this scene has a lot of layers. We are going to start with the sky. And as we embark on this scene, once again, this is going to be a practice in tolerating discomfort and in trusting the process and trusting that even if something doesn't turn out the way you initially anticipated, that doesn't mean that it can't still be magical and fun and a worthwhile experience. So, we're starting this scene with the first layer of the background with the wet on wet technique, meaning we're getting the whole paper wet with clean water. And then I'm taking a dark green, which I mixed with Hooker's green and Payne's gray, and I put a lot of water in it. And I'm just kind of along the edges of my paper, adding some of that very light value dark green along the edges, making sure to leave plenty of white space kind of blooming around in the middle. So we're almost using a similar technique that we used in day 1, the night sky, but we're doing it with that very light green, and then we're adding a little bit of yellow ochre. So the key to this very light value yellow ochre is I don't want to make a light green. I want some of the yellow to stay yellow. So just kind of gently mix some of the yellow ochre into the existing green, but try not to go overboard or else you'll lose the yellow ochre and only make light green. So while that layer is still wet, I'm using a thirsty brush to create sun rays, starting from kind of the middle of the paper, going all the way around in a circle. So, a thirsty brush, as a reminder, is a clean brush that you have blotted on your towel. So, it is mostly just damp. And the way that you use a thirsty brush is by dragging it along on the wet paper. And because the brush is damp, it will lift the paint instead of just move it around. So, using a thirsty brush while the paint is still wet to make those sun rays is a great way to kind of create this subtle light effect. And then as you can see during that hyperlapse, I did that same thing all over again. I let the layer dry and then I added the same exact colors in the same basic places using still a light value of all of those colors because I want to create depth, but I want to do it slowly and delicately. So I let those two layers dry. That's the background. And now for most of the next layers, I'm going to be using just kind of a random mix of Payne's gray and Hooker's green and burnt umber. I'm not really paying attention to what the color is. It doesn't really matter. But we're going to start with this background layer of trees. So most of these trees we're not going to see probably we're not going to really see them in in the final result. And so keep that in mind. Doesn't have to be perfect. But this process we're going to use for basically the whole project. We're going to start by painting in very light values, just like thick kind of crooked lines that span the length of the piece, and that will be the trees. And then while the lines are still wet, I'm using a thirsty brush, as you can see, to kind of bring out the sun rays that I painted in the previous layer onto this one. Even though the rest of the paper is dry, right? Only the trees are wet. I'm still using that same thirsty brush to just kind of paint right through the tree and create this gap line of white space that will kind of bring these sun rays forward. So I that was the first layer. And now I'm doing the second layer. These trees are a little bit more brown, but with each succeeding layer, we're going to get just slightly darker, probably slightly bigger with the trees. But honestly, that doesn't matter so much. Also, as you can see, straight lines don't matter so much. Sometimes trees are not in a straight line, they're usually pretty crooked. So that's something that I'm keeping in mind as I'm painting these trees. And it doesn't matter really how many you paint, just kind of eyeball it. That's exactly what I'm doing. I think I painted like 4 in the first layer and 6 in this layer. These are still firmly in the background. And so we're just kind of trying to create texture, but leave enough white space, especially in the middle where the sunlight is. Um, so that it won't look too busy with the next layers. And then we're once again using a thirsty brush to just kind of lift, extend these sun rays onto this layer as well. The key with painting these sun rays with a thirsty brush is to do those strokes with that brush while the trees are still wet. If they have dried before you get a chance to use a thirsty brush to kind of, create that gap or that streak in the trunk, then it won't lift the paint because the paint is already dry. So that's something that you might have to practice and keep in mind. If you do the thirsty brush technique and no paint moves, it might be because your tree already dried before you tried to get to it. And if that happens, you don't have to paint these trees all at once like I'm doing. You can kind of paint one and then do the sun rays and paint another and then do the sun rays, whatever really works for you. So as we're getting with this third layer, our values are getting even darker, right? It's still not very dark, but they're definitely darker than they were in the initial layers. And as I'm painting these sunbeams through with my thirsty brush, some of the paint from the tree is kind of smearing onto the background, right? First of all, don't freak out. That's going to happen. One way I can kind of get rid of that is just, calmly blend a little bit of that blurred paint right into the background. This is a messy piece. And so, I'm not really too concerned about many dried paint lines because there's a lot of texture going on here. And so I wouldn't worry too much about that, but we're going to talk even more about that as we continue on in this tutorial. So after I finished that third layer with just a few darker, slightly bigger trees, now I'm going to start to add leaves. This is not going to be my only layer of leaves. I'm going to start pretty light. It's a fairly light hooker's green and just kind of do some scumbling, meaning some random blobs in that corner to cover the trees. And then I'm doing the same thing that I did with the trees before, using a thirsty brush to um, to lift some of that paint and kind of help elevate the sun ray going through those leaves. At this point, some of the sun rays aren't working very well. That's okay. I'm just kind of going with the flow. One thing that I've also noticed is, if you wait for the paint to dry, the sun rays obviously won't lift. But if your paint is too wet, they won't lift either. So if those leaves, because I'm kind of blotting the leaves, right? Just kind of tapping with my paintbrush, there's a lot more water and a lot more paint in those little leaf blobs. And so if there are any kind of puddles, like if the paint is kind of puddling or it is more paint than you need, then when you do the thirsty brush technique, it's just going to smear the paint instead of lift it. And so that's something that I struggled with honestly throughout this project, is knowing when the paint was dry enough for me to do the lifting technique, but not so dry that it wouldn't work at all anymore. And that's why I am saying this project is 100%, even more than I think any project I've done in this challenge. This project was 100% a practice in understanding I'm just kind of going for it. So I did those leaf layers. Now I'm doing another layer of trees. And at this point, because the trees are a darker value, the paint is smearing as it was before. And so sometimes I just kind of blend the smeared paint in between so it's not quite as obvious. And other times I'm just kind of letting it be what it is, knowing that If I was looking at a scene like this in real life, honestly, my vision would be uh, it wouldn't be a perfect representation anyway, right? Because the sunlight would kind of be glinting in your eyes, and so it would be hard to see everything anyway. So keeping that in mind, that it's okay if there are some dried paint lines. It's okay if things don't look exactly right. I'm just trying to capture that feeling of the sheer majesty, right, of the sunlight kind of uh, backing up and streaming through these trees. So I'm doing some more foreground trees now where the trunks are still pretty light, but I'm using a little bit darker value for the leaves. And I'm putting the leaves similar to where I put them before, and once again, it's that same process of using scumbling to kind of tap in the leaves in that kind of random pattern, and then using a thirsty brush to brush through the wet leaves and hopefully lift some of the paint so that you can see the sunlight kind of streaming through. But, if the sunlight doesn't come through in very clear rays, if instead it just kind of you just kind of lift some of the paint randomly, that's okay too, because sorry for the gap. I thought I heard something in the background there, in my house. Oh, real life. If all that you did was make some of the paint a little bit lighter, that's okay too, because the contrast between the light value and the dark value in kind of that soft blended manner is really what we're trying to capture here, right? We're not trying to make exactly what sun rays are supposed to look like. We're just trying to create the mood of when sun kind of is blinding or washing out some of the scene so that you can't see everything. So that contrast, knowing that that contrast is what we're trying to capture with the final layers. So we've like carefully built a lot of these layers up a little bit at a time, doing the same techniques and gradually getting darker in value, meaning a little bit more paint per water ratio. With this final layer of trees, we're going to make them the darkest they are. And I'm going to put one dark tree kind of right in the center of where that sunlight's going to go. So these dark trees are kind of a little bit more on the gray side, meaning I mix some burnt umber with Payne's gray to get kind of that black grayish color. You don't have to do that color if you don't want. I just did a dark colors because that tree, especially the one in the middle, is right in front of the sunlight, right? So I did those trees. I painted some more foliage around the trees, and then I'm painting the sun rays coming from the center of the paper, like I have during most of this project too. Some of the sun rays I have noticed are a little bit off kilter. I didn't get my perspective exactly right, but that's okay. And then I'm painting some more foliage around the trees with that hooker's green. Maybe it's even a little bit of a dark green. And once again, just using the thirsty brush to lift some of that paint and make sure that those sun rays kind of come out from behind the tree. Now, at this point, some of my sun rays have gotten lost, and that's okay because I have gouache. I'm going to use Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, which is my favorite gouache to use in landscape paintings. And using not a lot of paint, I'm going to kind of brush on some of this white gouache to just emphasize those sun rays a little bit more. Give just another subtle layer of white paint in a translucent way so that the sun rays look a little bit more emphasized so that you can see them a little bit more. The key here is to remember that gouache, when mixed with water, can also be translucent, right? It's not just opaque. And so we're not trying to create opaque lines of gouache. We're trying to get that more translucent, transparent effect. And I don't want to overdo it. I'm just going to do it on a few of these sun rays coming out from behind the gouache, from behind the tree. And then to emphasize that contrast even more, I'm just kind of darkening this front tree a little bit more. But I'm not, as I was painting it, I decided maybe I don't want to do it like completely solid. Maybe I want to leave behind some of that previous layer just for kind of contrast and shadow on that tree. Because, when you have a contrast between a light color and a dark color, it just adds some interest. And so that's kind of what I was doing. It's almost like I was using the glazing technique to add texture onto that tree. And then I'm using that dark color again to add some leaves that are clearly in the foreground and in front of the sun rays. Although I was not very happy with the way that I painted the foliage on these trees. I think I couldn't decide if I wanted this tree to be a pine tree or if I wanted it to be something else. It mostly just looks a little bit awkward, and that's okay because trees look awkward in real life too. And so that's kind of, what I'm using, the line I'm using on myself to make myself feel better about the fact that I actually really love the background, but this foreground tree is not my favorite. And especially since it's at the beginning, I mean, at the very middle, it's clearly the first thing that people see. It bothered me just a little. So, to mitigate that, to make that kind of awkward tree not so forefront and center, I decided to use that dark paint again to create a kind of border of plants and branches coming into the scene from out of the scene, if that makes sense. So I'm painting some branches that are like jutting into the scene. They're just light branches, but I'm going basically all the way around. And that's just to add some details and to, that middle tree is still the main event. But I think those subtle branches all the way around add some fun details that make the contrast really cool. So there you go. A very, very messy project, a very messy sunlit forest, and I learned a lot throughout this piece. Mostly, I learned that you can feel like you're making a huge mess and like nothing is going to turn out okay. And it can still turn out okay. And even if it's not one that you want to like hang on your fridge or anything, you can still come away feeling like you created a little bit of beauty. So, what did I love about this scene? I loved the using the gouache for the sun rays. I loved that it was a true exploration for me. I haven't painted very many of these before. I've painted maybe one or two in the last 2 years, and I really wanted to stretch myself too as I was doing this challenge. And so I loved that it was that exploration. What I learned is that you can make a big mess and it'll be okay. I think one thing I wanted to do was maybe make that center tree a little more off center to be in line with the rule of thirds. But all in all, I'm really proud of this project. Thanks for painting with me. If you want to win a copy of my book, leave a comment, any comment. I would love to hear from you, and I will see you next time.